back. We're back, Ash. And we've got a friend down here, actually, is the way it's recording, it's downwards. We have the wonderful experience of having a legend of horror writing with us. Hopefully we won't embarrass him too much as we drool over his talent. But the multiple award
alone.
Well, I've never met anyone who's actually won a Bram Stoker award before.
Okay.
Let alone 3.
Yes.
Yeah. So, what's that you're reading, Ash?
Say again. Sorry, just in the middle of a book. One of my favourites. Yeah, one of my absolute favourites that's been with me for so damned long. Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
So we have with us, joining us in our discussion today, the absolutely wonderful Ramsey Campbell. Welcome to the Ash and Col podcast, Ramsey.
Gentlemen, thank you for having me.
It's having now indulged in the short story that you picked, as I'll explain to our listener. We asked the guest to pick the story this time rather than one of us two, and Ramsey asked if we could go back to H.P. Lovecraft again because he's a bit of an expert on H.P. Lovecraft stories. And of course, we're going to indulge. And so that's what we have done. So this week we have been reading Ramsey's Choice, which actually sounds like a really good feature, doesn't it? Ramsey's Choice.
Okay, so from Sophie's Choice.
Well, yes. And there's another one as well. There's the book about philosophy as well, isn't there, about choice? But
yes.
Ramsey, can you tell us, what did you ask us to read?
I decided we should have a go at what I regard as Lovecraft's first masterpiece, which is The Rats in the Walls, written in 1923. I think it displays many of his best traits, particularly the very careful structure and also modulation of prose. I think it's the first story of his that really exemplifies that, the very precise selection of language to particular effect and the kind of gathering of language as the story goes on. But more than that even, actually, I think that more than anything else he ever wrote, it's a story about language. So I think there's quite a lot to talk about.
That's brilliant. Absolutely. I've got to say, I have thoroughly enjoyed investigating it, and I'll go into that a little bit more afterwards. So give us the synopsis then, Ramsey.
Well, without wanting to ruin it too much for people,
don't worry about spoilers. We do this whole thing of spoilers. These books are 100 years old. They've had a chance.
But remember, you've only just read it, you see, so there are probably other people out there listening who are in an even more innocent position than you are now. But okay, basically, the narrator, Mr. de la Poer, which we'll come to in itself an interesting name, given the tradition of horror fiction, moves. It's one of the very few Lovecraft stories that actually moves to England rather than using America. And he moves to the old family manse of Exham Priory, beneath which there proved to be subcellars upon subcellars. And it becomes increasingly clear that his ancestors have been using these cellars for ghastly purposes, for breeding a sort of subhuman breed, which are then consumed. He reverts as the story goes on, and we end on, well, I think really quite a high pitch of sheer horror. I mean, unusually so for Lovecraft. I mean, there are many others that go for the sort of sense of cosmic awe, but this goes perhaps a little bit more for gruesomeness than is usually the case with Lovecraft. But it seems to me to be, well, quite something, as we'll perhaps discuss.
Cool. So that's going to lead me to the next part of this. Ash, I know you're a big Lovecraft fan. You use him as inspiration. You used him as inspiration on a series of books recently. What did you think?
I absolutely loved it. Yeah, I've got to admit, I thought it was an awful lot of fun. I loved the conclusion to the story. I loved the setup. The one part, and that's why I've got the name on the screen at the moment of Lovecraft's Racist Pussy, is because I was listening to this in audiobook form. And every time it got to the name of his dumb cat, I was just, don't call it that, please, H.P. Lovecraft. Change the name to something. And I think they called him in a revised version or a reprint in the 1950s. It was changed to Black Tom.
Right.
I think is a little bit kinder, because again, it's just the harsh language of. Am I right in thinking that he was a very conservative individual and into eugenics of a sort?
I don't know about the eugenics part. I mean, H.G. Wells certainly was, among others, but I don't know whether Lovecraft was in that. Conservative he certainly was, but, you know, by the 30s, he was going to espouse socialism as the only real solution to the condition of America then. And while initially, apparently, horrors upon horrors, he said he admired the boy, that is to say, Hitler, in the early 30s. By the time he learned what was going on with the Jews in Germany, he changed his mind. So I think it's fair to say that Lovecraft, in many ways, was developing. You know, had he lived to twice the age he did, which he certainly should have, except of course he starved himself to death virtually and got horrible internal complications, one suspects he might have moved gradually further left, but, you know, who can really know? I do want to address this issue of the cat, though. I mean, do you guys know the background to that name in the story?
No, I don't, Colin.
No. I funnily enough, there was something as it was all being said. As one of the things I like about these discussions is I like the way that things sort of like progress in terms of thoughts.
Yes,
a very interesting thought came to me as you were talking about, because there's a big difference when someone gives you the synopsis. Like I say, it's the way that I consume these stories is I always read them and I always listen to them. I have dyslexia, so it does change the way that I absorb the information. And then the one bit that I didn't quite get, which you just put across, was the fact that the family were breeding what was in the cellar.
Ah, yes.
Right? So
I think that's the implication.
The name of the cat takes on a completely different connotation.
Yes.
For me than previously, because and I'm going to use I'm going to sort of bring it in this way. It's just a little bit of a trigger warning because it is a racial slur the way that the name of the cat is done. With the cat being called Nigger Man, it does actually have that slave connotation, and then you've got on top of that this whole idea of the family with the slave connotation and breeding, you know, for the food that was being consumed in that way. That it all of a sudden actually sort of like becomes quite meta and folds in on itself a lot more.
Yes.
Am I kind of off the mark with that idea?
Well, I don't think you are in terms of reading the story, because I think, you know, narratives are open to interpretation. Whether that Lovecraft meant that, who knows? Whether his subconscious meant it, which is a quite different thing, as I can certainly tell you from years of rereading my own stuff and spotting stuff I didn't know I put in the first place. Yeah. We can't quite say. And let me just give you the brief bit of background on the cat. The reason the cat in the story is called that, and I suppose it's fair to point out that while it's, but without any doubt whatsoever, a racist name, you know, it's a favourite animal within the story. The reason for that is because it was the name of Lovecraft's own pet cat. Although it's fair to point out that the story was written, 19 years after the cat went away. In fact, what happened was the Lovecraft family moved house within Providence. The cat ran off, was never seen again. It was a favourite. It was a favourite of Lovecraft's. It was the only pet he ever owned. Now, when it ran away, he was 14. He'd already had it for several years. So it depends on how one interprets several. I assume it means at least 3 years. I would take it to mean maybe a few more than that. So he was really pretty young when that cat was named. And it seems to me there are only two possibilities, one of which was that, you know, he chose the name of the cat. And if it was offensive to his family, surely they would have said, Howard, you know, you can't call the cat that, call it something else, call it Black Tom, you know. Or his aunts, who were then his guardians, named the cat. So, I mean, I think there's a bit of a context.
And actually, yeah, that puts it in a whole different light as well, because the idea that the story is almost a tribute to a pet that he's lost. I mean, I'm a huge animal lover, and yeah, I can sort of like see the whole idea of putting a pet in a story and having that pet almost take on the heroic lead of the story.
Yes.
Because whilst we've got the main character who does all the heroic stuff and has sort of like the transition towards the end of it, it's the cat that sort of like has saved the day, that has been trying to maybe stop him from what he's becoming. Right. Thank you. That's put that in an entirely different light for me. Yeah. I mean, still, it's not a name that I'm ever going to call a pet of my own.
No, absolutely.
But the way the names get thrown around, because the names get thrown around quite a lot in the middle section of this story.
Yes.
When I was reading it rather than listening to it, my dyslexia was actually kicking in, and the names were starting to get confused. So I kind of had Captain Norris became the cat at one point.
Ah.
It just kind of turned around, which then actually put the connotation of the cat's name lying across the bottom of the bed as being the person of Captain Norris, and it all became very strange at that point.
Well, maybe that's the gay subtext that we haven't noticed.
Yes, so that was...
on the subject of gay subtext, am I right to share my screen? Because I've got a picture of the image that this Weird Tales one was in.
Right.
So, yeah, this was in Weird Tales. And, yeah, bear with me a second.
Down there, you can definitely use it.
Yep. Yeah, that was the cover of the original Weird Tales magazine that this particular story appeared in. And I appreciate the illustration is for the Houdini article about the spirit fakers.
Yeah.
But, yeah, there are definitely homoerotic overtones there.
And what do we think the skeleton is reaching for? He's hiding with his elbow.
Well, the thing is, it reminded me, and I was telling Colin before, it reminded me of a story. I had a short story published in a magazine that was called Man's Story 2. And the story was called, it was a pulp piece that I'd written called Slave to the Satanists. And they wondered if they could sort of like illustrate the cover, which they did illustrate the cover. But rather than Slave to the Satanists, I'm thinking that looks more like Slave to the Santa Claus. Which, yeah, bless him. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing this.
It's got the same skeleton on it, so I think.
Well, he gets around, you see, quite a bit. I mean, he's hired for every occasion.
Better travel than the rest of us, yeah.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, fun cover really for the Tales one, yeah.
Or a great tale. I'm gonna in terms of enjoyment of this story, I gotta say I absolutely loved it.
Good.
I loved it, I think, for the reasons that you were saying, Ramsey, is the language.
Yes.
You know, the actual story of it when it was going into the history, I thought was really nice.
Yeah.
I like all that kind of stuff. I noticed that it was always, hang on, this is set in England, and it seemed to be quite accurate, geographically as well, the way that he was positioning things.
Yes.
You know, which was quite good. And I was really sort of getting into all that, but when it really goes into the madness at the end, and it really goes for it, and then you suddenly find out where he is, and that he's actually locked up.
Yes.
That whole movement into that just picks up such a pace.
Yeah.
Within the manicness of it.
Yes.
I thought was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
You know, but I couldn't help but keep laughing at the middle bit because, unfortunately, being from the south of England as I am, he keeps talking about the Aris.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is one moment where he actually says he picked up a stick and poked the Aris. Now, for a southerner, it's quite funny.
Well, let me tell you something that, in my very early Lovecraftian imitations, which I set in Massachusetts, I came up with some thoroughly horrid notions of what New England rustics sounded like, which August Derleth gently persuaded me to do without, in fact. But then I relocated the book to England, the Inhabitants of the Lake, that first book. And you then have people from Gloucestershire speaking in equally unlikely accents, which kind of change within the course of a sentence into Cockney or Scottish or something like this. So it was a bit generalised, but obviously Americans didn't notice.
Yeah, well, they didn't notice for Mary Poppins, did they? So
that's true. That's true. Yes.
Yeah.
And people didn't notice with Spike in Buffy, and his accent went all around the British Isles and back again.
Yes, that's right.
So I've got to say, actually, I was absolutely stunned when I actually found out that he comes from Texas.
I didn't know that.
James Masters?
Yeah.
Wow.
His natural language is that whole kind of Texan twang type thing. It's like not as deep as that. Probably more like Joe Biden trying to do a Texan accent, I would have thought.
Right.
I was stunned because I thought he wasn't quite Cockney, but I thought he was actually from England at least.
Yeah.
No, apparently Tony Head had been tutoring him in between sets, sort of like saying this is how we would say it. So clearly Tony Head's got a very limited understanding of
most of his one is, would you like some coffee?
Ramsey, you'd mentioned about the name. We've got the de la Poor name. What were you going to say about it?
Yes, well, basically that was apparently a son of a branch of Edgar Allan Poe's ancestry. And I'm sure Lovecraft, knew that and put it in because of that. I think it's fair to point out that particularly the opening resembles Poe, specifically at the Fall of the House of Usher, in kind of conflating, the house in one sense and the house in the sense of the family. It also, I think, we're starting at the very beginning. You remember that. Well, let me see. What's the opening line? Hang on, I shall find it as we speak. It is. Oh, well, yeah. All right. On July 16, 1923, I moved into Exham Priory. Now, of course, now that sounds nostalgic to us. 98 years later. But when Lovecraft wrote the story, it was set in the present. It was just a few months before the time of writing. And so the opening actually conflates the Gothic mansion and the present, and that old kind of there's a sort of received wisdom that supernatural fiction should be set in the past. I personally, that's not me at all. I think the setting it in the present gives it a much greater immediacy, and pretty well everything Lovecraft wrote was set in his present, or at least. Well, occasionally there's events that have happened in the past that then affect the present, but in the main, it's happening now as he writes it. If you see what I mean?
Yeah, and I think this one.
Sorry, you go, Ash. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this one sort of like builds well on that whole notion of history and the past. And
very.
The majority of the story, as you say, it's got contemporary for Lovecraft as a feel, which it needs to be. I think. That was, on his name. Apparently, the title of Baron de la Poor actually existed in the Peerage of Ireland, and it was Anglo-Norman for the poor, according to what I've been reading here. The whole notion that he's actually come from the poor, I suppose, does tell us something about the perceived heritage and the normalcy of who we're dealing with. That it's a regular bloke.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, equally, now this is another thing about, that commonly argued that Lovecraft didn't have much of an eye for, an ear for, or, a talent for character, for actual characterization. And, it's often true that the central character is something like Lovecraft himself. Here, though, I think the very sort of sobriety and understatement of particularly of the early stages of the story is a way of characterizing the narrator. I mean, it's interesting to me. We never know his first name, if you notice. He's never called by it, because even when Captain Norris, of course, is the main other character with whom he interacts in a big way, as we'll see by the end of the story. But there's very little dialogue, which Lovecraft seldom went in for. That's why. But I mean, we know he's a Massachusetts businessman, a grey Massachusetts businessman, or he's merged into the greatest Massachusetts business life. But I think we get a sense of the character from his very reticence. I mean, he's lost his son was injured and then in the war and then dies. But our narrator doesn't express any grief about it, and he just refers to the mother as being absent, or we never learn what happened to her. So I think there's a real sense of repression about this character from the start. Whether Lovecraft intends it, I don't know, but I don't care. I mean, I think trust the tale and not the writer approach that I always believe in.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're absolutely right with that. And my issue, I think his characters. I think there is depth within each of his characters, more depth than we usually appreciate. It's just his dialogue.
Yes.
Usually, if I'm actually teaching a class on dialogue, I will sort of like say, "This is some dialogue Lovecraft's written." Don't. Which, I know that's disingenuous, but
Well, in terms of the character names itself and the way that he does his characterizations, we discussed when we were talking about Call of Cthulhu, in that there seems to be a certain amount of influence of H.G. Wells within
Yes.
his writing. And H.G. Wells does this unnamed narrator. So, I mean,
Yeah.
the most famous being The War of the Worlds, which
Yes,
seems
of
to have
course.
been a big influence on, like I say, seems to be a big influence on H.P. Lovecraft.
Well, Lovecraft did like The War of the Worlds, so yes, I would say you're right.
Yeah, and I think the characters are very similar feel, the way that he talks about things, because in War of the Worlds he does that kind of describing his environment and where he's going, and kind of more of a historical type thing.
Yeah.
I always say the best description of War of the Worlds is when he actually describes the mass movement of people across the fields, and it does have that kind of feel to it when he's talking about the history of the building and the way that it's built upon things, and there's that same. It's not the same thing. It's not like a mimicry of it, but it definitely has that same feel to it, I think.
You're talking about the Lovecraft now.
Yeah. Lovecraft himself, I think, has that same sort of feel. He has his own voice. There's no doubt about it, the way that he goes. But I think it has a feel of HG about it.
That's right. But what's interesting, I think, about the early stages about describing Exham Priory and his initial impressions of it, is that there's a strange sort of, well, not strange, but a very significant lightness of tone. He actually describes it as being perched perilously upon a precipice, which is, very deliberate alliteration of the kind that Bob Bloch would go in for a great deal more, Bob being one of Lovecraft's proteges, of course, later on. But it's very, very unusual in Lovecraft. It seems like a sort of jokey way. And I think the reason for this is that, the narrator is deliberately kind of fending off any notion that this place is in any way unnatural or haunted, and then he kind of basically pokes fun at the legends of the place. But interestingly, first of all, it's described as the village is regarded as a haunt of fiends and werewolves, which is, I think, a deliberately cliched description. But then once he gets, talking about the history of the family, I mean, the fireside tales that then turned into ballads that are rather more gruesome and specific. And then this thing about, tales about the family that are hackneyed spectral lore, but in fact, not all of them are. So it seems to be, again, a way of sort of fending off the possibility that there's something more to them than this. I mean, this was something that, August Earth pointed out to me very early on, that Lovecraft begins with this sort of, generally speaking, this sort of tone of doubting that these things could really add up to what they add up to, and then the narrator is gradually persuaded and eventually confronted with the truth.
It's interesting you mentioned the alliteration there, because that phrase where he's talking about a flock of fungus flabby beasts.
Oh yes, that's right.
Because it just that and the one that you mentioned both leapt out at me whilst I was reading this, and I was thinking, is it something that he's using deliberately? Are these the only instances? And although we've got sort of like 3 or 4 F sounds or P sounds in the examples we just mentioned, he repeatedly goes for the alliteration. He's sort of like the Exham edifice, and there's the Horsham horror, or he just seemed to duplicate these, which again gives us that sense of strength within the character, that there is something more to the characterization than just this is a pulp piece of fiction.
Yes,
I think it gives it a historical flavor when you have a certain amount of that, because I think there's a lot going on in what he's writing that is very, very similar to old Victorian weird tales going back to around about the 1850s when he would have been a kid.
Yes.
And there's definitely a lot of that kind of stuff going on, as we're now finding, because I'm now reading so much of this older ghost stories. I'm beginning to see these kind of things. It was interesting what you said about ghost stories should be set in the past, which I think is a more contemporary idea, because when you go back and read Victorian ghost stories, they're all set in the contemporary setting going into old houses.
Yes.
But they're always sort of like told from that perspective. What I really like in what a lot of what Lovecraft does is he kind of tells things in flashback, but doesn't tell you that's what's happening. And so you find out as a reader, you kind of dive into this world, and he drags you in. Like you say, he starts off with nice little edifices, or maybe a little bit of a nod here and there. I think there's a little bit of a nod to Dracula as well, actually, at the front of this story, because he does mention Camforth Abbey as well. So
yes.
it was tiniest little thing, but then it goes into the werewolves and the very kind of gothic tropes that come out.
Yes.
And so it kind of brings you into it, and then you end up in this madness, which is where I think, you know, where it kind of goes, and it goes into this whole kind of mind-bending experience that by the end of it, you're not really sure whether or not he's even experienced it. Like you said, I mean, the Captain Norris character, which I was thinking jokingly, you could say Captain Norris really got into the character of the narrator. But that whole kind of thing of where you end up in this world of madness, I actually don't think there's many people that can write that kind of insanity like H.P. Lovecraft does. I actually think Shirley Jackson gets as close to it as you can possibly get in the
yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Although I think again we're going back to Poe, because clearly, you know, Poe is the progenitor of so much in the field, you know. I mean, when you think about it, you know, well, for me, he invented the contemporary horror story, basically the modern horror story, not least by, you know, refining it into the short story rather than the Gothic novel. There's still many Gothic elements there, but, you know, he's reduced it, reduced in the best possible sense. I mean, you know, he's distilled it.
Distilled it, hasn't he?
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than reduce, he's distilled it down. He took it into elements to make it stronger. It's like a good whiskey, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. That's right. And so, you know, things like the Telltale Heart or the Black Cat, for that matter. I think we can see the roots of the Rats in the Walls to some extent in those stories. Which, you know, I mean, Lovecraft. It was in many ways Lovecraft regarded Poe as the absolute pinnacle of the field that he was trying, as far as he was concerned, failing to scale. I mean, we know better, but sadly he didn't.
Yeah, there's a lot of this, isn't there? Because I mean, it's like when they're doing their writing, when you got, and I'm going to bring in those kind of things. When you got Poe and you got Stoker and you got H.G. coming through, and then you got H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah.
You know, from the position they're writing to the position where we now write.
Yes.
So we've now got this wealth of tremendous talent, you know, ahead of us. You know.
Oh gosh, yes.
And so we are constantly sort of like feeding off all this stuff that comes before us.
Yeah.
Which is why it's nice to deconstruct it sometimes, because you almost get into your own head of where your own ideas are coming from. So I'm going to turn that on its head towards you on that side of things, because the classic question we always get asked as writers is, "Oh, where do you get your ideas from?"
Yes.
But I'm going to turn it on and say, look, if you were writing this story, let's say you've got the basic premise that you've come up with, you know. And we know how H.P. Lovecraft has approached the story. So how would you approach writing something like this that has a historical beginning going through to a completely batshit ending?
Oh gosh, I think my tendency is to interweave the historical somewhere in the middle of the narrative and only have it gradually discovered, which of course Lovecraft does as well, but the basic discovery happens very early on in the narrative, I think. And then we gradually get trickles of worse and worse things that he then finds out about. But I think I'm well, to be perfectly honest with you, when I think about it, probably I wouldn't be doing it that much differently from Lovecraft. I can't think I'm still doing that now from novel after novel.
What about you, Ash? And you have recently been writing in a Lovecraftian.
Yeah, I have, and it's such a difficult one, because this one is just structured so well. You've got in your structure, you've got the orderliness in the opening lines of this is where the history has come from, this is what's happened, and it's almost like you're reading a historical description of it. And by the end of it, the guy's gone fucking batshit, and you've got no idea what planet he's on. And I think that all of that, the fact that we've gone from such a solid, wonderful, stable structure to such a disintegration of that man's psyche, that I'm with Ramsey on this. I don't think the setup for that one can be surpassed. I just think it follows such a perfect arc of, here's strong, steady, stable. Not that I'm trying to be Theresa May saying that, but strong, steady and stable all the way to, he falls off the mental cliff. And, I wouldn't do it in any other way than he'd done it, except I'm hoping I would have given the cat a different name.
True enough. Well, yeah. And I mean, I'd have more.
Boggy, you might have called it, or something like that.
Yeah, indeed. But I mean, I'd have more dialogue, but that's me, you know. I mean, I like writing dialogue basically. But is it again that you really only significantly got two characters in the story, haven't you? I mean, you know, Mr. whoever it is, de la Peur, and poor old plump, amiable Captain Norris. I mean,
hey, don't knock him for being plump.
No, but you know,
more attractive features, really. Yeah,
I think true, but I mean, you know, that's how he's introduced very early in the story, and I mean that first adjective comes back to haunt us quite a bit, I think, doesn't it?
Yeah, it works really effectively.
Yes. Now, again, you see that there's this whole thing. I mean, I'm coming back to language again, but looking as you know, as we go on through the story, there's this whole sense that the narrator is using language to hold back the reality. So, you know, the cat gets restless, and this is described as being trite, and its later behaviour is described as picturesque and so forth. You actually get kind of painterly images of well, you know, something out of Fuseli, you know, architecture and lightning and so forth. But, you know, I think that it's the nightmares that begin to invade the narrative, which, of course, is the one thing that the narrator can't really control about himself, you know, is how he dreams. And each of these, you know, each of these nightmares reveals more, although he doesn't grasp any of it. We may. I think I would argue, you know, that the method of horror fiction can often be like tragedy. You know, we can see where the character's going long before they can, and we're trying to hold them back. But you know, they're not having any because they don't know where they're going, or they don't realise where they're bound. You know,
that's that classic horror mechanic, isn't it? To let the reader or the
yes
know something that the character doesn't.
Indeed. Yeah. I'm just looking at this out of the second nightmare, where you know he's seeing the creatures down in the abyss. I did observe the flabby features of one of them, and then awaked with such a scream that Captain Norris, who had not slept, laughed considerably. He might have laughed more, or perhaps less, had he known what it was that made me scream. Now, you know, it's all there but for the first time in the story, we probably don't quite see what that's implying. But, you know, again, it's one of those things that creeps up behind you, you know, as you go further into the story and breathes down the back of your neck.
There's a very interesting thing, I think, with the nightmares as well, in when he goes off to London
to
do some research. When he gets back, he makes a point of nothing has happened whilst he's been away.
Yes.
First night back, he goes to sleep very, very quickly and instantly has a nightmare.
Yes, that's right. And I mean, I think one suspects that this is yet again another conflation within the story. I think that, you know, we can assume that these nightmares may be a kind of ancestral memory, because otherwise there's no possibility he could be having them so accurately, so that, you know, something that the house of de la Peur is beginning to rise up through him, little does he know.
Yeah.
Now, there's this whole central thing with Lovecraft, and it turns up in other stories as well. I mean, the Mound and the Shadow Out of Time. And there's this whole thing about descending down level after level. And, you know, in each case, probably, particularly, perhaps crucially, of the Rats of the Walls, you know, each level reveals more and reveals worse. And I think you can argue in this story particularly, it's also, if you like, a descent into the subconscious, into his ancestral subconscious. And so you get, you know, everything is being merged on a psychological level.
I think that's very, very much in the final level that they can't see down. It's so dark, and they only go down it very, very briefly. That really does have that connotation of that kind of hidden memory of not wanting to remember.
Yeah.
And that's where the atrocity comes out of.
Yes.
He ends up in that dark place that he can't remember anything out of.
That's right.
So it's like that whole dark tunnel is a metaphor almost for the repressed memories of some hideous action that's happened to him in the past.
I think so. Now, there's that one extraordinary and very Lovecraftian detail that's never explained, which is that, you know, the passage has been constructed to the vault, you know, the vault where the final horrors are revealed. it's actually been constructed from beneath.
Yeah, like they're trying to escape.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe that.
Yeah.
Or does it mean that something, from even further down has come up and is somehow involved in this? Has it? I don't know. Has it mated with the de la Pers or?
Yeah, he mentions Tartarus at some point, doesn't he? Suggesting
yes, he does.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is going to make me sound like the stupidest person on the face of the planet. But that won't be the first time. But we've got a story here that's called The Rats in the Walls. The least frightening thing within this story is the rats in the walls.
Oh, yes. I think that's right.
Why on earth do we think he's gone for that as a title when there are so many other fields that are open that could have...
I think it may be, in indirection and restraint, and also I suppose that was, as one understands it, that was where the initial seed of the story came from. Although it wasn't quite this. It wasn't. He was writing then I think I read in an apartment, and I think what happened was he associated with the sort of creaking and so forth of the building with the sound of rats behind the wainscot or whatever they would be, and I think this is where the story came from. Presumably, he kept the title from his initial idea. That's what I would assume. But you're right, of course. But again, some of his titles are, like The Whisperer in Darkness or The Horror at Red Hook are pretty overt. But a lot of them are much, like Cool Air, let's say, are a lot more understated. They have a sort of evocative quality, but that's not what turns out to be frightening within the story, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's the whole thing with titles that they just sort of like give us a taste of what's to come, but they don't give us that full picture. And
Sure.
It does give us enough of a suggestion that, do you know what you don't want? You don't want rats in your walls. Story. Right. And do you know what? I've read the story. I'm going to go with rats in the walls rather than the other crap that happened there. Yeah.
Well, true. Very true. Very true.
Isn't it? Because the whole punchline at the very, very end is that nobody believes this story.
Yes.
That it was the rats that did the eating. It was him.
It's
very Life of Pi when you think about it in that way.
Oh yes.
In who did all the eating?
Yeah.
And who they eat?
Who ate all the pie?
Who ate all the pie? The pie ate all the. Anyway, but then you have that whole thing of when at the end is they will only ever believe that it's rats in the walls.
Yes.
It's almost like what he's doing with that title is saying, for whatever supernatural thing you can come up with, there's always going to be someone who comes up with this. Oh, it's going to be the wind in the window, or that moved the curtains. The rats in the walls is the reason you have strange sounds in the house.
Yes. So although interestingly enough, of course, earlier in the story, it seems like nobody else can hear them.
Yes. Yes.
Which is curious. So are they really gnawing at his mind, or is that where they are? We don't know. Except that old Black Tom, he chases them down into the abyss. So there must have been some rats to chase, we would think.
But even then, he actually has a subversion of the trope at that point, doesn't he? Because he actually talks about how trite it is that dogs
yes,
can usually see.
That's right. That's right.
So he's actually quite. I suppose meta is the word, isn't he? He is actually being quite meta in the way that he's and intertextualizing what's going on in the story itself, and then almost using that to layer upon the madness. I
think so. Yes, that's right.
I want to go back to one point you made, Ramsey. The fact that we sort of we get this structure of things getting worse and worse and very worse.
Yes, yes.
And it's interesting that we've got the history of family gruesomeness, which is, that's a terrible thing to have happened. Then we move on to sort of like, and I'm living with this horror of a house where there's noise that's stopping me from sleeping and all the nightmares. Then we've got the horror of cannibalism. And finally, we've got insanity.
Yes.
And it's just interesting that insanity comes at the bottom of that. The whole notion of losing one's mind is more frightening than coming from all of these areas or being a participant in these horrendous acts.
Yes, yes. It's also regression, though, isn't it? In his case, it's very overtly regression. I mean, his language actually regresses. So you could almost argue that, well, I think I would argue that, in one sense, it's, the levels of language are like the levels of the house going down to the cellars. He equally plunges back into, linguistic history and into eventually linguistic primitivism.
Sit with him a bit more. We'll have the Proto-Indo-European route out of him, won't we?
Well, that's right. That's right.
I got a point to make on that idea as well, actually, because if you take in Dantes Inferno, for example, where you have the layers of hell, the levels of hell, and Judas is at the top level of hell as being the worst sin is that of betrayal.
Yes.
And if you take that as an allegory coming backwards, you could actually say that the betrayal of the mind is the worst thing that can ever happen to you.
Yes, indeed. Well, of course, I mean, it is a common thing in Lovecraft, isn't it? The narrator who, having seen that revelation, loses his mind. There's also another motif which I think, runs through Lovecraft's work, and interestingly kind of develops in a, well, let's see what we think. Which is the whole business of the usually, in fact, I think in every case, it is, no, almost every case, it's the narrator who discovers something about themselves, about their own nature, and usually about their own lineage. And so we've got Arthur German, who sets himself on fire when he discovers where he's come from. We've got Pearl de la Peur, we know what happened to him. And then we get the outsider, I think, which is, I do think it's a possibly, and I guess you guys have both read The Outsider?
Yeah, I used it as part of my PhD. Yeah. Yes,
good, excellent. So, well, I mean, that it seems to me that that it may be a sort of autobiographical metaphor to the extent that Lovecraft was himself brought up as his mother pretty well told him he was monstrously ugly. And because I think she was losing it a bit apart from everything else. And so you get the narrator realizing he is the monster. But then we move on from that to something like The Shadow over Innsmouth, where again, the narrator realizes, he is one of the, the sea people, the Innsmouth folk, but it's not presented as necessarily horrific in that story. Now, it depends whether we think that Lovecraft is, assuming we will be, we'll find this horrific and monstrous anyway, and just because the narrator doesn't, that we know better than the narrator. But you can also read that as being a sort of progression toward acceptance, and if you like, to the extent that The Shadow over Innsmouth is read as a kind of racist metaphor, which it certainly has been, then it would seem almost as if there's sort of a beginning of acceptance going on in that story. Equally, not the same thing quite, but The Mountains of Madness, that the monsters, the creatures in the Antarctic, actually are accorded a degree of sympathy and respect. They're actually, in fact, there is a line that goes something like, I'm paraphrasing here, but something like, monstrous and alien as they were men, or words to that effect. So again, you seem to have this increased progression toward a kind of acceptance, which I suppose, in a way, you can argue is, Lovecraft accepting himself. Certainly, if you accept that that's, in some say, he's personifying himself as these various narrators, and that, in a sense, again, if we want to get, deeply psychological, though, and this is just me arguing off the top of my head, there was partly self-loathing that required him to project outward onto, the other races and treat them as being, monstrous in some fashion. Well, that's a mouthful. There you are.
That's a hell of a lot to think about.
Just came into my head. I'm sorry.
No, but that's, what, Ramsey, that's what we've actually found with doing this podcast.
Yeah.
The original idea is not to really look at the historical context. We look at the historical context, but then we try and kind of really get into the idea. What is going on in someone's mind.
Yes,
sure. And I think is absolutely fantastic. It's a really good, because there's like you say, is acceptance, and there's almost like, because my original coming to Lovecraft came through role playing, because I'm a big role player, and I play Call of Cthulhu, and I've recently written one of those. And part of that is this idea of madness. And so, you don't die so much in that role playing game as you go mad. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
And I think there's that whole kind of thing of acceptance and inevitability. That you go, oh, well, this is the inevitable end always. I was thinking about a pitch meeting. I was thinking about the idea of H.P. Lovecraft going into his editor and saying, I've got an idea for a new story. He has to go, does the protagonist go mad by the end? Damn! But then, like you say, is that softens. So it stops becoming scary and becomes inevitable. And so therefore the horrors can start coming in other places in that way.
Yes.
Like you say, and sometimes there is that acceptance. It's inevitable. My mother went mad. It's inevitable. I'm going to mad. Why fight it? Now move on to the next bit. So I think that's a really nice theory, that.
Something that just occurred to me, just purely in passing, was completely off the top of my head. But we've been discussing structure a lot, and the particular sort of progression, from hints to bad to worse to utterly horrendous.
Worstest.
Indeed. and the one, somebody else who I think does this extraordinarily well in his best work, no longer with us sadly, was Nigel Neal. I think all of the first three Quatermass serials and films too, actually, and also the Stone Tape, have very much that structure. And in Neal's case, perhaps I think it was his specific approach where you sort of got to an explanation, and then beyond that explanation was something that's not quite explained, and that's bigger, and each explanation can't contain the next revelation. And particularly so wonderfully in Quatermass and the Pit, where you've got this expansion from kind of apparent kind of folk legend into something pretty damn well cosmic, and that's very Lovecraftian.
Yeah.
Although Neil probably wouldn't have admitted that because he didn't like to own up to being influenced by anybody, apart from I think from M.R. James to some extent.
Well, I must admit, I've never even. I love Quatermass. I'm a massive Quatermass fan.
Me too.
I wanted to for years try and see who holds the rights to it, because I want to write a novel of Quatermass's granddaughter.
Well, I would think would it not be Matthew Neal now, his son? Because there was the lady, who was the lady the tiger who came to tea? Who was that now? Judith.
She died recently.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So she was probably the rights holder up to that point, but no, his son Matthew.
Probably right.
I think would be the guy to approach.
I've actually met a woman, not in that kind of sense, who actually.
My God, that was a bold thing for you to say, Colin. You've met a woman.
I actually met her.
Did she have legs and everything?
Quite an interesting thing, actually. But her name is Quatermass, and her grandfather knew Neil, and that's where he got the name from.
Good
Lord!
It was
an interesting name.
Yeah.
Oh wow! She was a role player as well. So
I must say, I thought he'd made it up, but there you go. You learned something.
An actual name, yeah. But no, I love the Quatermass, and I particularly love because Russell T Davies, I think, is very much like that in the writer as well. In Quatermass styles.
Yes.
But I never really completely connected that. And it was cosmic horror, but it didn't have, it wasn't so unwieldy as H.P. Lovecraft is. Apart from the third one, actually, the ITV one, that was as close to it I would have thought.
Oh, the John Mills, you mean?
The John Mills one,
not
the film version, but when it was the full length.
Yes.
3 hours of it was absolutely fantastic.
You can't get that now on disc, actually, the complete version.
Oh, that's right. Christmas lists.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Have you anything else to add there, Ash?
Loads and loads of things, but I don't want to. I just can't tell you how much I've enjoyed chatting. This has been my favourite hour of the entire year. I mean, and that's not saying a lot because it's 2021 and 2021 has been pretty shit. But Ramsey, your thoughts are just sort of like giving me a lot of different ways of looking at this. And it's just been so entertaining and so informative listening to what you've had to say about it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, guys. Thank you for having me.
It's been wonderful. I mean, I do. The only reason we have to wrap it up after an hour is because my computer can't handle over an hour.
Okay.
I've got to ask though, Ramsey, because it has been absolutely astonishing. I love doing these because we always end up learning loads when we do this, in terms of our own thoughts as well as what other people do. And this one has been, one, so informative, and two, just been a fantastic chat, which is why I went into academia. You know, I'm trying to get a degree now because I want to go into this world of just talking about books. It's great. What have you got lined up at the moment? I mean, you've done. I know you've had various things recently. Yes. I know you do a lot of editing, and you do a lot of short stories, which we love. We are both subscribers to short stories being the future of literature.
Okay.
I know I sent you a copy of Blood Ink.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
The last story is probably the closest to this one, funny enough, about descending into madness.
Okay, I'll take a look.
It was quite fun. It's called 28 Days of Social Posts. Right. And I actually originally wrote it on Facebook. Okay. Collated it together. So that was
yeah.
But so what are you working on now? What have you got going on now? Let's promote to our couple of people that subscribe to this.
Oh Lord, well actually, right now, the just come out. Well, there's a new novel from Flame Tree Press called Somebody's Voice, which has been very controversial, but some people have liked it. There's a collection of novellas from PS Publishing called The Village Killings, and you know, I try not to repeat myself. You always do, but you try not to, you know. Yeah. But one thing I haven't really done before with the title novella, because there are 5 of them in this book, The Village Killings, is sort of my attempt to do a kind of combined celebration of and kind of critique of the Agatha Christie style of whodunit. And I'm quite happy with that, actually. I mean, I mean, the thing is, you know, you wouldn't go to Agatha Christie for great prose, but there's real linguistic dexterity there and real ingenuity on all sorts of levels. And in a way, the very kind of flatness of the prose is her way of hiding stuff in plain sight and, you know, challenging you to realize what you've just read, because she was an absolute genius at making you make assumptions you oughtn't to make, you know, without spoiling a particular instance. She was absolutely great at that. I tried to do a little bit of that in this story. What else is happening? Oh, the trilogy, my Lovecraftian trilogy, that's coming. Well, that's been coming out from Flame Tree, and the final volume, The Way of the Worm, is out in March. And then they've got a new novel called Fellstone, which is kind of cosmic too, in the summer. So that's some of what's going on. And folks, here's something you didn't know, or maybe you did, I don't know, but might not have guessed. I'm also completing a 70,000 word study of the Three Stooges.
Oh wow! Okay.
Wow.
Follow that.
Yeah, so there's 70,000 words on the Three Stooges.
Absolutely. Oh, it's about saying yuck yuck.
Oh, fantastic! Well, there you go. And I hope you've written some of that down, Ash.
Yeah, I have. I've written this down, and this is going into my shopping list for later on. The Agatha Christie thing sounds absolutely fascinating because I love a bit of Agatha Christie.
Oh, well, let me know what you think. Yes, let me know.
Definitely. Is Way of the Worm in any way influenced by Bram Stoker?
No. You think of the Lair of the White One? No.
Yeah.
No, it's my
a different worm.
Yes, very much so. It's the serpent from the garden, but it's also Deoloth from my first book. And I'm trying to go back to my Lovecraftian roots and do better than I was able to do with them when I was 16, basically. And I'm pretty happy with the trilogy in many ways. You know, it spans like 70 years and gets bigger and bigger as it goes on, if you see what I mean. More and more.
Yes. Oh, right, yeah, I'm looking forward to all of those. Yes.
Well, we need to mention that on the various like the Horror Book Club, for example, on Facebook, and we need to mention it on your. I don't do a newsletter because I'm really rubbish at self promotion. I'm the worst at it. But but you know, you put it in your newsletter as well, Ash.
Yes, I will do.
I think it's right that we should, you know, shameless promotion is exactly what everything's about.
Absolutely, but yeah. Yeah, that was fantastic, Ramsey. Thank you so much. And yeah, that's one thing off my bucket list now. I have always wanted to talk to you. You have been sort of like on my hero list for fucking ever. And yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And look how anti-heroic I've turned out to be.
Yeah, well,
bollocks. You've been just such a legend. Yes. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask 2 questions now.
Go on.
My first question is, Ramsey, will you come back in the future and talk about something else with us?
Absolutely. Or I'll come back from the past if you prefer.
I could read Bradbury there.
We've all had our Microsoft shots, so we can move in time now.
Oh, good. Okay.
And Ash, this is the big one. What are we reading next week?
Right. Well, we've just read Rats in the Walls, so I'm sticking with the subject of rats, and I want to do The Judge's House by Bram Stoker.
The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. We're going back to his short stories.
Yeah. It's one of my favourites. I really, really like that. That's as much as I'm going to say. I've got to let you read it. If it's one that you're not familiar with, Cole, in that case, yeah.
It haunted my childhood, I'll tell you. It haunted my childhood.
Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it? Yeah.
Can you give me your 1-sentence personal review on Judge's House? And you just did it there.
Well, that's really it. Yes, that's right. It haunted my nights. That's it.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, thank you so much. Hit the subscribe button, hit the
like button, tell friends.
There's these modern things that kids know about. So if you don't, ask your kids how to do it. I don't know.
Absolutely.
And Ramsey, it has been an absolute joy and honour, and I look forward to our next conversation. This has been absolutely brilliant.
Ash and Col, thank you for having me.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Ramsey. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Cheers, guys. Bye.